on Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, a critique of the classic poetic polemic of post-colonialism. Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism was originally published in 1955. It has become a foundational essay on the nature of colonialism in the academic study of post-colonialism. Significantly, until the Soviet Union repression of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, Césaire looked to the Soviet Union and Stalinist socialism as a future model for society. With this in mind, while Discourse on Colonialism presents as a class politics, what it actually represents is a culturally essentialist, racialised identity politics. Césaire critiques the destruction of progressive anti-capitalist, black and brown societies by a regressive colonialist, white society. Employing populist class rhetoric, bourgeois Europe is exposed as a diseased and dying civilization which is pretending to be otherwise. Europeans in toto are presented as suffering from a generalised disease in which they have descended into savagery and barbarism. We must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam, and in France they accept the fact, each time a little girl is raped, and in France they accept the fact, each time a Madagascan is tortured, and in France they accept the fact, civilization acquires another dead weight. A universal regression takes place, a gangrene sets in, a centre of infection begins to spread. At the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison has been distilled into the veins of Europe, and slowly but surely the continent proceeds toward savagery. A genuine class politics understands social agency and change. A culturally essentialist racialised identity politics, on the other hand, fixes and locks into place opposing camps of people with innately bad or innately good essences. Césaire frames European colonialism as the original fascism. All Europeans, he suggests, have an inner Hitler. Césaire introduces the concept of the boomerang effect. Specifically, that the Europeans invented colonial fascism, which was employed beyond Europe, and then this fascism boomeranged back into Europe. His argument proceeds. What the white European man could not tolerate about Nazism and Hitler was not the crime against humanity, something he points out the white European man tolerated in the colonies, but rather the crime against the white man. And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers stand around, the racks invent, refine, discuss. People are surprised, they become indignant. They say, how strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves, that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms. That it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them. That they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimised it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. Yes, it would be worthwhile to study clinically, in detail, the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism to reveal the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century, that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside of him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, and that if he rails against it, he is being inconsistent, and that at the bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to European colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the niggers of Africa. The prehistory and history of racism in Europe and the concurrent development of the idea of race and the ideology of racism, alongside the idea of nation and the ideology of nationalism, does not feature in Césaire's thinking. Discourse on colonialism very much reflects a colonial model of racism, centred exclusively on white European colonialism and a colour line of white versus black and brown, the white man versus the Arabs or the niggers or the coolies. Racism is assumed exclusive to an external colonial context, which boomeranged back into the interior factory of colonial racism. The concept of the boomerang effect is popular in post-colonial leftist thought, consequently reducing the history and geography of racism and fascism and the intersections with nationalism and totalitarianism into a reductive and restrictive lens of white European colonialism. A lens that sees the world's ills as essentially and exclusively the ills of white European and US and later Zionist colonialism. Here, for example, Zionist racism enters the frame and anti-Jewish racism vanishes. As I explain in my book, Outcast, How Jews Were Banished from the Anti-Racist Imagination, the racism advanced by Hitler was based on the belief of a cosmic warfare between the Aryans and the Jews, with the objective of achieving a living space for Germany through the final solution. Jewish people posed a threat to the nation state on the basis of their existence as a diaspora. Zygmunt Bauman elaborates in his book Modernity and the Holocaust. By the very fact of their territorial dispersion and ubiquity, the Jews were an international nation, a non-national nation. The Jews were not just unlike any other nation, they were also unlike any other foreigners. In short, they undermined the very difference between hosts and guests, the native and the foreign. And as nationalhood became the paramount basis of group self-constitution, they came to undermine the most basic differences, the difference between us and them. Other than Césaire, Hannah Arendt is also attributed with the concept of the boomerang effect. However, what Arendt actually argues in The Origins of Totalitarianism is that the camp of Nazi totalitarianism represented a descent from the colonial camp, from a space in which everything is permitted into the realm of everything is possible. Many things that nowadays have become the specialty of totalitarian governments are only too well known from the study of history. There have almost always been wars of aggression, the massacre of hostile populations after a victory went unchecked, until the Romans mitigated it by introducing the Pars Subjectus. Through centuries, the extermination of native peoples went hand in hand with the colonisation of the Americas, Australia and Africa. Slavery is one of the oldest institutions of mankind, and all empires of antiquity were based on the labour of state-owned slaves who erected their public buildings. Not even concentration camps are an invention of totalitarian movements. They emerge for the first time during the Boer War at the beginning of the century and continue to be used in South Africa as well as India for so-called undesirable elements. Here too, we first find the term protective custody, which was later adopted by the Third Reich. These camps correspond in many respects to the concentration camps at the beginning of totalitarian rule. They were used for suspects whose offences could not be proved and who could not be sentenced by ordinary processes of law. All this clearly points to totalitarian methods of domination. All these are elements they utilise, develop, crystallise on the basis of the nihilistic principle that everything is permitted, which they inherited and already take for granted. But, and here is the critical point, but Wherever these new forms of domination assume their authentically totalitarian structure, they transcend this principle, which is still tied to the utilitarian motives and self-interest of the rulers, and try their hand in a realm that up to now has been completely unknown to us, the realm where everything is possible. And characteristically enough, this is precisely the realm that cannot be limited by either utilitarian motives or self-interest, regardless of the latter's content. What runs counter to common sense is not the nihilistic principle that everything is permitted, which was already contained in the 19th century utilitarian concept of common sense. What common sense and normal people refuse to believe is that everything is possible. We attempt to understand elements in present or recollected experience that simply surpass our powers of understanding. The incredibility of the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps is closely bound up with their economic uselessness. Capitalism is fascism. Colonialism is fascism. Europe is fascism, Césaire formulates. This is his inverted formalisation of colonialism's formula of Europe as the leading progressive civilization out to save the rest of the world. This Stalinist dual camp school of thought re-racialises and re-essentialises the world from the progressive civilization of the white colonial race of Europe versus the savage and barbarian black and brown races of the colonies to the progressive black and brown races of the colonies versus the savage, degenerated and barbarian white race of colonial Europe. The white European people, Césaire spells out, in treating the other like animals, have transformed themselves into the animals. Indeed, the diseased and altered essence of Europe reflects a barbarism, he argues, only surpassed by the United States. Comrade, you will hold as enemies, loftily, lucidly, consistently, not only sadistic governors and greedy bankers, not only prefects who torture and colonists who flog, not only corrupt, check-licking politicians and subservient judges, but likewise and for the same reason, venomous journalists, goitrous academics, reefed in dollars and stupidity, ethnographers who go in for metaphysics, presumptuous Belgian theologians, chattering intellectuals, born stinking out of the thigh of Nietzsche, the paternalists, the embracers, the corrupters, the backslappers, the lovers of exotism, the dividers, the agrarian sociologists, the hoodwinkers, the hoaxers, the hot air artists, the humbugs, and in general all those who, performing their functions in the sordid division of labour for the defence of Western bourgeois society, try in diverse ways and by infamous diversions to split up the forces of progress, even if it means denying the very possibility of progress. All of them tools of capitalism, all of them openly or secretly supporters of plundering colonialism, all of them responsible, all hateful, all slave traders, all henceforth answerable for the violence of revolutionary action. Césaire makes plain that he does not advocate a return to the past, yet his description of past societies prior to colonisation are nostalgic and romantic. They were communal societies, never societies of the many for the few. They were societies that were not only anti-capitalist, as has been said, but also anti-capitalist. They were democratic societies, always. They were cooperative societies, fraternal societies. Césaire acknowledges that contact, connection and exchange between different societies is a healthy thing, just not through a bourgeois Europe. Whereas Marx and Engels recognised the contradictory tensions and outcomes of an empirical reality of globalising capitalist social relations, Césaire does not. The future is explicitly spelt out in Discourse on Colonialism. We can look to the Soviet Union and, with a Stalinist stagist prognosis, Césaire sees capitalism and colonialism on an inevitable path of barbarism and self-destruction. He talks of a law of progressive dehumanisation, illustrative of how Césaire, rather than challenging the rarefication of the idea of race, which problematically makes race real, he re-rarefies race in his anti-colonialist and anti-racist vision and politics. And while he speaks of the proletariat, of the working class, actual class analysis and class struggle does not feature in his poetic polemic against colonialism, except as a dual camp struggle of regressive degenerating white Europe versus the progressive rest, who will soon inevitably arise. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.